Okay, good. We're ready to go. Thaddeus, Russell, I'm so pleased to have you here. I saw you in New Hampshire.
Yeah,
Yeah, but you were so surrounded by people, I couldn't even get to you. I mean, I had to like hold a special hangout just to meet you.
I don't think anyone knew who I was when I was there until I spoke.
Well, I knew, and I was in awe, but then you said such outrageous things that everyone wanted to just strangle you and tackle you afterwards, and I decided to just let them go for it.
Heaven forbid, yeah, outrageous things.
I,
Yes.
I, I didn't protect you at all. I just
I remember thinking, who's the guy in the bow tie? I got to meet him.
Yeah, well, it didn't happen for some
Trying to
reason.
stand out in that crowd. I mean,
Yeah, you're just kind of bailed out. No, it's a good group and a lot of interesting thoughts. So did you enjoy it?
oh yeah, no, I loved it. Yeah, it was great, and the video had an even better life. I mean, it's really a
Oh,
lot of people have seen it and commented on it, and there's been a lot of discussion about it. So.
oh, is that right? Okay,
Video
that's
of the talk I gave, yeah.
yeah. Okay, that's what I don't think I've seen my video from the conference. I think my talk was actually rather boring in some ways, but I mean, look, everything's boring compared to your talk, so that's what
Oh,
happens.
come on now. Flattery will get you everywhere.
Right, right, right. So your book, Renegade History, of course, has got, it's a classic in our time, right? But I wondered if we could talk today along the same lines. Because I mean, you sort of march through history and you see these kind of vagabond, these dangerous characters, these social outliers, these people that are sort of living scandals, to those around them, as essentially progressive forces of history, people that are kind of making a future of liberty and civilization that, a couple of decades later, everybody's like, yeah, of course that was cool. We just didn't know it at the time, right?
Right.
So in our own times, we're seeing the demonization of like cyberpunks, and I'm particularly interested in online drug markets and things like that. Do
Oh,
you
right.
do you follow this, and what are your thoughts about these things?
The Silk Road stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Peripherally, I didn't have to say it. I didn't dig too deeply into that. I mean, I obviously followed this stuff generally, but I didn't research. I mean, I sort of know the basic story.
Yeah. But does
Uh,
it fit with themes that you know? I mean, it must sound recognizable to you. I mean, what's it like for you to see these things going on? You're like, oh yeah, this is old stuff.
yeah, I mean, so first of all, digital commerce, right, is sort of opens avenues for the bad people, which is, and then they get punished for it, right? And yeah, so that in itself is an old story for sure. I guess so. Then it comes down to a question of morality, and this is what I've been teaching, or moralism, which I've been preaching. Ironic use of the term there to libertarians, which is, I think that if you're interested in liberty, you gotta be wary of moral policing as well as state policing. So the Silk Road guys, I think, would be free or free to do what they want if we were free of moralism. So actually, the law, I think, is less important here. The law would have no teeth; it would have had no effect, or it wouldn't exist if there weren't a culture or a moral norm that dictates that what they were selling is bad.
So you
Morally.
see, as you look back in history, you see the laws as kind of an extension of sort of a public culture of tolerance or intolerance, depending on the time and the period and the issue.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's not even an unusual position to take, I don't think. I mean, I think I don't know most, but a lot of people, certainly scholars, legal scholars, I think would argue that's laws spring from the dominant morality of the time, right? So take segregation, the Jim Crow laws of the late 19th century. I mean, that there's no question that they rested upon ideas about race in the South, and sort of a moral code in the South already, right? And they wouldn't have existed were it not for that. Or, and then we have the other great example, or many examples we have, is all the laws on the books now that are unenforced, right? So why are those laws unenforced? Sodomy is a great example, right? I mean, so sodomy is still on the books in some states, right? As being illegal, and it certainly was in almost all the states for a long time, but it was basically unenforced. Why? Well, because most people didn't there was not a moral code that was strong enough to make it enforced. Or jaywalking in Manhattan. That's the other one I always use, right? Jaywalking's illegal in New York City. It is illegal, always has been. Do people do it? Everybody does it all day long on every block, right? Because there's no moral code enforcing it. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the issue here. Now that's not to say that we shouldn't do all we can and fight against bad law, like the one that punished the Silk Road people. But to me, the bigger fight is about the morality that upholds the law.
This works in the reverse too, right? So you get bad law as an extension of, I mean, as an extension of a kind of a cultural intolerance or just a prevailing ideological position, right?
Right.
So, but how does this happen? I mean, do you have sort of politicians chasing the culture in a way, as a way of kind of saying, look, we're great, we're important, you need us to bring about your values?
Well, they also create it. They create the culture. It's sort of a circular thing. I'm sort of Foucault. I'm basically won over by Foucault's argument that power is not top down, that it circulates horizontally. But politicians are certainly part of that circulation of culture, and part of the creation of it. But they don't. It's not like they come up with the what is bad and what is good, and then impose it on the masses, and then all of us believe in it, right? We have to buy into it. I think that people voluntarily. This is the hard thing, and this is the sad thing. People voluntarily buy into their own oppression. They voluntarily buy into ideas like, oh, well, marijuana should be illegal. Homosexuality is bad and should be illegal and should be punished. Or black people should be separated from us physically. Even black people and homosexuals bought into that, right? I mean, they bought into those things as well. We know this is true. Even a lot of drug users, we know this, right? In fact, I would bet most drug users think that what they do or did is bad, and that they should have been punished for it. They should have gone to jail. I think a lot of them feel that way, and because they internalize these ideas. So it's never, I don't ever believe in this sort of model that the left often adheres to, or the right does too, that there's bad people with all the institutional power who sort of make us think particular ways, right? I think that people buy into them. There's particular ideas that have purchase in people's minds for various reasons, and so you have to sort of offer them an alternative.
Well, let's talk about the race case, for example. So Jim Crow emerges out of a kind of a racialist ideology, one that says, look, these people are too different to live together. One must be on top and one must be on the bottom. And so this prevails for a long time until this becomes an intolerable position and the law adapts in some ways. But not towards a tolerant position, just overall, but rather a kind of a reconfiguration of a sort of a demographic central plan. And so then you get a mixture of like old ideology, a new ideology, and a kind of a legal labyrinth of confusion that leads to a furthering of resentment and conflict.
I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at there, but for me, the real history of the rise and fall of Jim Crow is that from roughly the early national period, early 19th century, through World War II, what we now call scientific racism, perfectly respectable. It was the dominant idea. So Harvard professors taught this in their classes, right?
Yeah, it was all in the economics journals, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So all the amazing stuff like about phrenology and skull sizes and all that stuff that we now consider to be crazy witchcraft was absolutely respectable and dominant. And so that's where Jim Crow comes from. So when the South attempted to enact those laws separating people, the North said, well, okay, that makes sense, and hence the Supreme Court's decision in 1896. Then what happened was World War II came around, and the United States had to mobilize against a regime and had to justify this mobilization. And so what they did was they said, hey, those ideas over there that we have to fight are bad. The racialist ideas of the Germans and the Japanese, that's evil. And so you actually can see, and it's in my book, but many people have talked about this. You can really see this remarkable sea change in those years in the way that public intellectuals in the United States and in Europe, especially in the United States, just overthrew the idea of scientific racism and discredited it. So by 1945, 46, that was discredited. You could no longer use the N-word in public and be respectable. You could no longer say that there are different biological races and there's a hierarchy among them and we have to fashion our laws around that idea. And so now we are where we are, which is that those ideas are absolutely forbidden. And what if you speak them in any way, in any form? And the Donald Sterling case is a great example of this. Even if you say it privately on your phone to your girlfriend, you will lose your property, or a job, or you will certainly be shamed publicly in the harshest ways imaginable. So that's what killed Jim Crow.
I mean, is it possible to do a counterfactual and imagine that this would have happened even without a world war?
Sure, but I mean that was really the this is all, so I'm kind of contradicting myself in a way. I mean, this is sort of top down, and basically it comes from intellectuals. I mean, for me, it starts with literally books that were written during World War II. The most important one was Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, which everyone who studies it, no matter what their position is, identifies as sort of the most important book on race during this period, and really changed the minds of prominent public intellectuals. So respectable people respectable people basically overturned that idea about scientific racism, and then it gained purchase from below. It sounded like you were getting at something that's also interesting, which is that, so then what happened was the federal government literally mobilizes against racism, that kind of, and segregation, right?
Right.
You literally have the army following those ideas. The army literally comes down to the South and forcibly desegregates it in various ways. But also there's a shaming that goes on, which doesn't really take off until sort of the late 60s, early 70s. But since then, I mean, it is, I would argue, the worst thing an American can do is say something that's perceived as being racist. I think that in terms of the psychological punishment is greatest for that now in our society. I think it's worse probably than committing murder in some ways. You certainly, I mean, the Donald Sterling case is a great example of this. I mean, who really cares what this 80-year-old guy says to, or who should care what this 80-year-old guy says in private to his girlfriend? But it's been the top news story for how many weeks now? And everyone, all day long on my Twitter feed, it's about how terrible Donald Sterling is and how they of course are superior to Donald Sterling. That's the important thing here. So yeah, I mean,
it creates a kind of a blowback. I mean,
that's what you were getting at, yeah, and that's really interesting. So, yeah, exactly. So right. So what happened was they kind of the dominant intellectual, the intelligentsia, with the power of the federal government, basically chased those people into corners, right? The scientific racists, they chased those people into very dark corners, chased them underground, where they've remained festering. And then what's interesting is that since the 60s and 70s, you see this blowback. I agree with you that there's been blowback in various ways. Donald Sterling is the least of it, right? So, against busing in the early 70s in Boston, and the way that was articulated, but resentment of the tax system has often been racialized. If you look at the tax revolt of the late 70s, I mean, there's lots of debates about this, and I'm not even sure.
Resentment against quotas and universities, against...
Certainly that goes on, yeah. And as someone who's been disqualified from 2 job searches because of my race, Yeah,
but here's the thing. You've got these kind of laws on one hand, and then you have like aggressively racist policies on the part of, like New York City with the stop and frisk, kind of policies. You've got, kind of a detention system in the jails that are, the enforcement of the drug war, which follows a definite sort of racial bias there.
Yeah.
So you have both working at the same time.
Gosh. So, Camille Foster, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He, we talked about this. He actually argues that it's not racist, and I think it's a powerful argument. I'm not exactly sure where I stand on this. The effects of those laws and those policies undoubtedly create a racial caste system. There's no question about that. The effects are racial. There's no doubt about that. But for him, it's about class, and I'm sympathetic to that argument that
Hmm.
that the society placed those people at the bottom economically and socially, and whoever's at the bottom of a society, in terms of class,
Vulnerable.
will suffer from laws like that. So if you took stop and frisk exactly that policy and put it in another society, it would be a different color going to prison or getting stopped and frisked. Or if the drug laws here, if you put that in another society, it would be a different color, or
Right.
it'd be the same color as the dominant. If you put it in Ireland, people would look the same as the president. So, or well, they would all look the same. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think that class is probably more important here in terms of why it hit the people it hit. The effects of it, of course, are racialized. Now, in our country, one of the unique things about the United States is that, in my view and the view of many people, class has always been articulated through race.
Hmm.
So that the way we Americans have talked about black people in particular is the way that Europeans talked about the lower classes.
Right.
Uh, Still do, sort of working class, right? So, and then also you see that actual sort of the cultural traits of African Americans, and this is a prominent theme in my book. The cultural traits of many of the cultural traits of African Americans have looked a lot like the cultural traits of working class Europeans. And then so when the working class Europeans came here as immigrants, and this is a major theme of the book, you then see when they first get here African Americans and those immigrant groups commingling, cohabitating, creating these new cultures, very in tremendous harmony before the immigrants decided to become white.
Well, you've got this raises a very interesting point about the role of kind of disobedience in breaking down
Yeah.
legal regimentation, central planning, impositionism by governmental structures. I did an article the other day about Benny Goodman, and and in the course of doing the article, I realized that actually he was kind of one of these cases of a guy who just like disobeyed the prevailing ethos and the law by hiring black band members and traveling around therefore sort of bringing us an element of associational progress and greater humane treatment of people just by sort of thumbing his nose at the prevailing ethos.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Benny Goodman was great. Oh God, I was just thinking about his
Right.
his small group which was one of the first integrated bands, and
Yeah.
some of my favorite music. But
it was illegal for him to travel, for his band to travel in the South.
yeah, sure, yeah, yeah, and I do a lot on jazz. I mean, actually, it's funny I don't talk about Benny Goodman in the book, but a lot on jazz, and that's where you see this great sort of nexus of criminals, the mafia, who were the first people to pay jazz musicians, the first people to operate nightclubs that employed jazz musicians, and African American culture, which of course in itself was essentially culturally illegal, right? Um, and commerce and free commerce, right? Sort of all coming together and creating what we all now consider to be the greatest thing America's ever produced. Right? Which is celebrated every year where? At the Kennedy Center, right?
Yeah.
Every year there's some jazz guy, some old black jazz guy gets up and gets a medal from the President of the United States, and not just from Obama. Every year, Dizzy Gillespie would get it from George Bush, and I mean everybody. It's America's classical music, and look where it came from. Oh, I left out one important element. It also came out of prostitution, right?
That's right.
Jazz was
ragtime music. But you're talking about before the advent of jazz, right? You're talking about in the 19 teens, right?
Sure, from the very beginning, yeah. So ragtime, and even before ragtime, kind of in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, sort of there's a music that kind of bridges kind of the slave music and ragtime. But anyway, yeah. So that was all played in brothels, and and lower class saloons, you know, and those are kind of the those are the star locations of my book. And
Yeah.
one of the things that just struck me over and over again, and I've never seen another historian say this, but it's just obvious when you do the research. When I was doing the research for the book, every time I turned around, I was looking at a lower class saloon or brothel and seeing unbelievable racial integration there.
Yeah.
I mean, integration that would shame the United Nations. I mean, where it was like, and I'm talking about beginning, in terms of the records we have, beginning in the 1760s and 70s. You know, from there all the way to the present, the lower you go economically and socially, the more integration you see.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, and I say this over and over and over again, I think in the South, you see it still. I think the South is more integrated than the North, and I think it's partly because of class. Because the South is lower class.
Well, I mean, I've certainly been my experience, Thaddeus. I mean,
yeah, right. I mean, I've always said this. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Georgia and some in Alabama and a little bit in Mississippi, but every time I go, it's like, you know, I walk into a restaurant and I see black and whites.
Yeah. Everybody's cool. Everybody's great.
You don't see that.
Yeah, and if you spend a lot of time in the North, and you come to the South, it's shocking. If you spend a lot of time in the South and you go to the North, it's shocking.
Yeah, I love the South. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's counterintuitive. But this theme that you keep bringing up about the role of commerce and sort of bringing people together is a very interesting one. I mean, like to perceive commerce as essentially a kind of a revolutionary force, you know, a sort of a template for disobedience and non-compliance. This keeps coming back in so many ways. You know, when you think about, you mentioned earlier the war on pot, for example. I mean, what's to my mind changed over the last 20 years is that, you know, pot has really gone from being sort of a daring do thing that was, you know, on the outskirts of society and sort of hidden, to now it's like crazy. Ubiquitous. I mean, like, I have a hard time believing that there would be this much pot use in a world in which it was legal. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, am I wrong about that? I mean, it seems like crazy, like the tabooization of this, the illegalization, and the constant war on the stuff has actually like caused it to cause a reefer madness in a way.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, my grandmother, when she was about 87, was smoking it for her pain that she had from osteoporosis. and this is a grandmother. I mean, not just a grandmother, but a grandmother who just was pretty conservative. But so yeah, the respectability of pot, sort of interesting. But this is sort of a different point about commerce. I mean, so two things. One thing, commerce or the market. You know, I say this in the book directly in the chapter on shopping. It's really it's on the sort of commercial or consumer revolution of the beginning of the late 19th century. Which, by the way, Anthony Gregory told me it made him cry. He loved it so much. He loved that chapter. I say it directly in that chapter. You know, the market has always been the best friend of renegades. Always. You know, if you look at my book, all the heroes in it, all the bad people who sort of broke social norms and created freedoms that we all take for granted, almost all of them were operating in a market system. You know, if you look at the brothels that I talked about, the saloons that I talked about, right? I mean, prostitution generally, gangsters who, you know, sold liquor when it was illegal. They were the first people to invest in gay bars. That's commerce, right? In the 1930s, they invested in gay bars. They basically made Hollywood possible by fighting off the Edison monopoly, you know, in the streets. I mean, it's market. It's two things. It's amorality combined with the market, right? It's amoral people entering markets. That's it. And those are my people. The slaves are the only ones who sort of fall outside of that, of course, because they couldn't operate in a market. Although the second they could operate in markets, what did they do?
They made stuff and sold it.
They made stuff that people in Stockholm and Jakarta and Moscow are listening to as we speak. So, you know, they changed the world. Yeah.
Hey, I have to ask you, and it's like an obvious question in a lot of your statement. What do you make of the unity of the political cause of conservatism and free enterprise, which just seem to be so tied together in the sort of political culture of the United States? I mean, is it just fraudulent? Is it ridiculous?
I guess my only question I have, the only mystery to me about it is why has it happened? Why, why is the Republican Party configured the way it is? I mean, obviously we see that it's breaking apart now along those lines, which is wonderful, and I can't wait for it to happen. It's going to be so interesting. I'm assuming it's going to happen. You know, when the Rand Paul libertarian wing splits off from the nutbag Christian conservatives, you know, and they can have their own party. It'll be fabulous in so many ways.
But how could that happen? I mean, there's like two official parties, and nobody's allowed to do
well,
anything
it
else.
comes out of okay. I think actually it largely comes out of a reaction to liberalism. I think that you can see that really clearly in the 60s and 70s, the era I was talking about, and it has a lot to do with what we were talking about earlier about race. So liberalism became, both in reality and in people's minds who opposed it, the party of sort of secularism and statism.
Yep.
So the state replaced God for them, right? And became the party of the expert who has state power.
Mm-hmm.
The expert, the administrator, who will not only tell you how you should live, but make you live in a particular way, based not on biblical rules, but on the rules established at a campus somewhere. And they can do it at the point of a gun, right? So by taking your taxes or putting you in jail if you violate the law, but mostly taking taxes. So I think that it was really a reaction against state control. You know, and so the secularization of it, I think, was part of it. So
then Republican-style ideology emerges out of a kind of resentment against power impositions and elite control.
Yeah, all you have to do is look at George Wallace in the 60s, 70s, and Nixon to some extent. But Wallace, it's all in Wallace. Look at Wallace's amazing speeches when he was running for president. He ran for president 4 times, I think. 64 to 72. Just look at those campaigns and what he was saying. It's incredible. You sort of see the creation of the modern right there, and it's and you know, of course, Wallace by most liberals is just sort of dismissed as an old, you know, segregationist cracker, which he was to some extent, but he was far more interesting than that, and much more sympathetic. If you see that what he's mostly angry about is the control by elites of working class people.
Yep.
You know, by people who were highly educated with a lot of money, and most importantly, who controlled state power, telling others how to live and then forcing them to live in a particular way. Now, part of that was they were forcing people to desegregate, you know, so that was kind of good, sure, for sure. But there's a whole lot else going on there. So if you look at Wallace, very little of what he complained about in those presidential campaigns was segregation, or the abolition of segregation. He hated sort of these upper class elitist intellectuals with state power.
Yankee imperialism, essentially.
Yeah, and he was saying, why are we spending money on foreign aid? You know, he wasn't anti-war, unfortunately, although he wasn't exactly pro-war either. But he was more he was kind of a John McCain interventionist. It was sort of more about kind of the masculine pride of the country, protecting that, than this idea of reshaping the world in our image, the liberal imperialist. It wasn't about that at all. But anyway, so I think that was very much a reaction to New Deal liberalism, you know, and its sort of modern incarnation in the 60s.
Well, it's puzzling to see how long we're going to be sort of stuck with these old paradigms. Let me tell you a quick story. Did you ever go to the Silk Road when it was around?
You could go. There was a physical place.
No, well, I mean online. Did you ever visit it?
No.
Okay, probably wouldn't shock you, but okay, let me just quickly tell you what happened to me when I went there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of the generation that had been lectured to by police and official sort of cultural icons and the establishment for my entire life against the evils of dangerous drugs, right?
Right.
Whatever, meth and speed and coke and cocaine and whatever, so. And so I haven't really been like that exposed to these things, like at all. So when the Silk Road was still around, I drifted over there um, online and got to see an Amazon marketplace of everything,
Hmm.
meth and heroin and cocaine and
Hmm.
crack and everything. And Thaddeus, I guess the reason I'm telling you the story is that, and I'm not sure I can quite identify. Maybe you can understand this, but in a strange way, it made it all seem kind of non-threatening and rather normal to me.
Yeah.
Do you understand? I mean, like I could see it for the first time and see that these were just products that people make and other people buy and consume, and
Yeah.
that's sort of the beginning and end of it. And it actually wasn't like demonic and culturally threatening or deeply
Well,
dangerous and horrible. It actually seemed very mundane,
yeah.
plain. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but it's not. It is actually demonic. It is. Drugs and alcohol actually are what they say they are. Not that they're going to destroy your life, but that they're going to destroy the culture.
And you're all for that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. Of course. Right. So, well, duh. So alcohol drinking is central in my book, right? It's from the beginning to the. In fact, I think the first page of the book is there's a mention of drinking and how much drinking was being done in the colonies, which was staggering, right? And how the founding fathers hated this, and they said, "Oh my God, we can't found a democratic civilization with all these drunks." And they were right. They were right. So they cracked down in all kinds of ways. Not the founding fathers, but the generation immediately after, who took state power. Locking people up, moralizing against it, firing people from their jobs for drinking on the job. But the drinking continued, of course, and so in my lower class saloons, where all the great integration was going on, where jazz was created,
Right.
was drinking. So brothels, same thing, drinking. So and then drugs. I don't talk a lot about drugs in the book, which is sort of funny. I mean, there's some, but I don't. I don't know why. Drinking has actually just been more important historically, but drugs are certainly important too. So here's the thing about drugs and drinking. Number one, they make it difficult to work.
They do.
So that's cardinal sin in this society, right?
Yeah.
They make it more likely that you will have sex outside of marriage in some bad way. Cardinal sin number two in this society. And number three, they make it more likely that you're going to break the law. Even if the drugs themselves are legal, you're more likely to break the law if you're drinking or doing drugs. Okay?
Mhm.
You're gonna break rules, whether it's an actual law or just a moral rule, right? You're gonna do bad things, right? Well, hey, sounds good to me. Now, does that mean that we should go drink as much as possible and shoot heroin and do meth and all that? I mean, maybe. And I mean that seriously, like maybe. Like
Uh-huh.
this stuff about, we are trained, and you were sort of alluding to this, and I think we're basically the same generation. I mean, I grew up with Just Say No in the 70s and 80s and whatever. Dare and all that shit. We actually, and it occurred to me, well, Jacob Sullum has written about this a lot. He's really good. But it occurred to me, like, I had internalized this notion that if you do cocaine, you're going to be addicted, and it's going to ruin your life. Well,
Right.
as a
Yeah.
matter of fact, and Jacob and other people have done the work on this, it's like it's rare for people to have their lives ruined or to become addicted or to have real problems. When they do, I did cocaine. I did a fair amount of cocaine 20 years ago. I haven't touched cocaine since. and it didn't do anything to my life.
By the way, this is true of cigarettes too. It's not just like hard drugs. They say this, about cigarettes that they're just deadly addictive. I mean, I was just in Brazil, and like nobody smokes in the daytime or even during the week, and then
Yeah,
the weekends come, and
yeah,
like 100% of everybody smokes at every party, and
yeah.
that's just what you do. I mean, everybody's like nighttime weekend party smokers.
I know lots of people who smoke sometimes and don't smoke other times and don't care. It's not a
Right.
big deal.
I mean, it turns out people can actually like manage this stuff, and
Right.
that's
So
don't control our lives.
do some people get addicted, and does it ruin some lives? Absolutely. But again, we have to break down this idea that that's the norm. It's not. So anyway, so generally speaking, socially, from my perspective, we're going to have a better society if people drink and do drugs. Frankly, I mean, I think if you look at the two most liberated decades in American history,
Yeah,
certainly in modern American history, we all agree 20s and 1960s.
that's right.
What was going on then? More drinking because of Prohibition, ironically, but there was more drinking. Women were drinking more during Prohibition. And in the 60s, right? Drugs. So, and were those, I mean, to me, your politics, I know a lot about your politics based on what you think of those two decades. Were they perfect? Of course not. But generally speaking, did our culture move forward during those decades or backward, right? If you're a classical conservative, you should, and they do, think that the culture moved backward. If you're not, then if you think it will move forward,
Well, but
general.
what happens, Thaddeus, is that the further you get away from the period, the more the conservatives look at the previous, at like one revolutionary stage backwards in time as being actually the good old days. One of the things that drives me crazy is that people listen to music from the late 20s and early 1930s or watch movies from those periods and see that as the good old days when everything was intact, the culture was solid, it was beautiful. What I hear in this music and seeing these movies is revolutionary and inspiring. It seems like bursting out of the confines of regime politics at the time. But conservatives tend to look back and go, oh, see, that was the good days before the hippies took over. But you're arguing that basically it's the same revolutionary impulse.
Yeah, and so what you see in both those decades is a widespread, not even a general one, not most Americans, but a widespread refusal to do two things, which, the two things that are the two pillars of this culture, which I've always argued. One is work, and two is to be married and live in a nuclear family. So that's what was going on in the 20s. That's what sort of marks the 20s and 60s, is widespread lack of interest or disinterest in those two things, and having fun, in public with other people. That's it. That's what was going on there. And a lot of that wasn't created by drugs and alcohol, but it was certainly, facilitated by it. So.
Well, let me ask you a really fundamental question then, just sort of about your politics, your worldview, your historiographic ideology, or whatever you want to call it. Like, why do you think it's so important that regimes, broadly conceived of, social structures plus law, be destabilized?
Oh, well, it depends on what you want, right? So I think I try not to moralize even against my political opponents, right? I think I actually respect conservatives because they know who they are. It's, if you think that we should work all day long and we should then, after we're done working, we should come home and be with the wife and kids, and that's the end of life, fine. I mean, then you know what you should go get, I actually respect Rick Santorum. I do. He knows what he wants, basically, and he's consistent about it. It's like we're on the opposite sides of the barricades, but he knows what he wants. So I don't want that. I want part of that. There's part of me for sure who I'm interested in stability, security. I'm interested in. I think work for itself is a ridiculous idea, but I gain pleasure from work that is meaningful to me. Nuclear family. I think we really need to talk much more about this as Americans. I mean, I think it's a real problem. We have this idea that if you don't live in a nuclear family, you basically live in misery, and you'll be unfulfilled. And I think this I think this affects women especially, but it affects all of us, you know. For God's sake, even George Clooney gets, you know, people feel sorry for George Clooney because he's not been married until now, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. So just a lot of the freedoms that I appreciate come from people who have destabilized moral regimes. I guess that's the answer to the question.
Yep.
Really, I tell people, you know, don't start with abstract principles when you're figuring out your politics. Definitely don't start with what other people should want or how they should live. That's what the left does.
And the right.
And don't start with morality. Start with one thing. Ask yourself, what do you want in this life? And I have no idea what that is, and I have no business telling you what it should be. If it's totally different than mine, if you're Rick Santorum and you want to live that life, that is your business, and I respect that. But if once you come to your values, and I mean individual values, not moral values, but individual, I value the freedom from work. I value going to the movies. I value, you know, whatever it is, sex outside of marriage. I mean, whatever. Playing video games, and whatever it is, then you can figure out a politics that flows from that will deliver those things to you. You can figure out a politics that will best deliver those things to you, and that's what I tried to do.
And your answer to that political question is essentially is maximum freedom for everybody to live the way they want to.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, so here's where I guess I differ a little bit with libertarians. I guess it sort of makes me a minarchist, although I don't know.
I don't believe that you're a minarchist. Stop saying that.
I don't know what I am. I'm my own man is the answer. I'm obviously very, very sympathetic and close to libertarians on a bunch of stuff, but there are some important differences. But anyway, no, and like early in the book, in the introduction, I say, you know, I'm not calling for a renegade revolution. I don't want the prostitutes and the drunkards and the slackers to take over. That would be terrible. That would be a living hell. I mean, I say that in the book. No, the thing is that there will always be, or certainly there always have been, moral guardians and people who want to govern and manage. And I say, fine, go do that. I don't want to do that, right? And all I say is, you know, but I'm going to take the side of their problems, the people who represent their problem, you know. Yeah. Because in that's sort of an eternal struggle, or it seems to be an eternal struggle, right, between those who go their own way individually against those who go toward the community. I'm going to take the side of the individual, generally speaking, and most importantly, I'm not going to shame people for violating moral codes. That's what I'm not going to do.
Well, now that we've exposed your essential un-Americanism.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
I urge everybody to go get your book, Renegade History of the United States, and I would love also, and this is something we can talk about some other time, but I'd love for you to teach some classes in Liberty.me because we have a wonderful teaching platform for you, and so many people. I mean, you just have so much to teach, so much to say, and I'm glad also for this digital medium that allows me to get somewhat close to you and actually talk to you one-on-one after all this time.
It's wonderful, yeah. It's been great. A lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Thaddeus, and we'll be in touch soon.
Okay, good. All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
That's it. Bye-bye.